Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, from wherever you're joining us. And welcome to today's webinar titled, It's Time for Change, How to Promote Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Respect in Your Chemistry Lab, featuring Dr. Elaine Nam and Caitlin Arnhold. I wanted to take this moment to thank our sponsor of this event, ADInstruments, for making it possible. And with that, I'm going to welcome Caitlin. Hi, Caitlin.
Hi.
All right, you can take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay, sounds great. Welcome to our webinar today, everybody. We're excited to have you here. Before we get started, I'd like to go over our agenda for today's session. We're going to start by doing some introductions, talking about DEIR and why it matters in chemistry. We'll do a quick poll about your experiences in science. And then we'll talk about some facts about underrepresented groups in STEM, specifically chemistry. And then the main body of our presentation today will be sharing some strategies and resources that you can incorporate into your own teaching practices, with a highlight on ADInstruments learning platform, LT, which is designed to enhance in-person lab courses. You can do a lot of these things that we're going to share with you today without using LT, but we will be highlighting the LT chemistry content collection that we've developed in partnership with Vernier Science Education. At the end of our session today, we'll have a Q&A, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions that you all have. Okay, so to get started, my name is Caitlin, and I am the Business Development Manager of Chemistry Education at ADInstruments. I'm working at ADInstruments. I get to do everything from content development to marketing to supporting our customers and helping them implement LT into their teaching practices. And then Elaine, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Elaine. I am the Director of Chemistry at Vernier Science Education. We do a variety of things in our group. A lot of it is technical support for educators. We do customer training for our products and curriculum. And also we do a lot of the product hardware development. And one of the items we're going to highlight today is the GoDirect SpectroVis Plus Spectrophotometer.
Great. So the American Chemical Society is committed to promoting DEIR so that all individuals in chemistry can thrive. Each year since 2020, ACS has published a diversity data report to share baseline diversity within ACS's journals with the hopes that transparency helps to build inclusion and diversity in publishing. In their diversity data report from 2021, they shared this really fitting quote, and so I just wanted to share this with you. Chemistry is known as the central science, not only because of its role in bridging the physical sciences and the life and applied sciences, but also because it impacts broad areas of human endeavor. Yet, while chemistry may touch all of our lives, we are not equally represented in chemistry. Before we get really into the meat of our discussion here, I think it's important that we talk about what DEIR is. I think we've all heard of DEI, but I've really come to appreciate the incorporation of respect into this important work. These definitions are taken from the American Chemical Society's website, which have been adapted from the Ford Foundation Center for Social Justice. Diversity is the representation of varied identities and differences. Equity ensures fair processes and treatment, equality of opportunity and advancement, and impartiality with access to information and resources. Inclusion builds a culture of belonging by actively inviting the contribution and participation of all people. And then we have respect. Respect ensures that each person is treated with professionalism, integrity, and ethics, underpinning all interpersonal interactions. And I think we can even expand this to include respect in the way of appreciation of our differences. By appreciating how we're different and the different ways that we approach problems and the values that we bring to our community, we can better solve the problems that we face in the world. So I've compiled data, like I said, from multiple sources, such as the US Census, a report from the National Science Foundation called Women, Minorities, and Persons with Disabilities in Science and Engineering, and additional information from Data USA, a website that aims to make US government data more accessible to the public. If you're interested in the resources or the references that I used to kind of gather this data, I'd be happy to share them with you at the end of the presentation. By compiling this data, we can see how racial diversity changes as students advance through STEM or chemistry careers. So note, it's interesting that the undergraduate enrollment in the fall of 2020 closely mirrors the demographics of the population of those under 18. It's been shown that when students enter college, about 20% of students show an interest in STEM independent of their race. So the same percentage of students from different backgrounds are interested in STEM. But then we can see as they progress through their degrees that especially like if you look at the degrees awarded in chemistry, that Black and Hispanic or Latinx students are not as well represented as they were when they first enrolled. And it's thought that this can be a result of opportunity hoarding that happens for affluent students that are predominantly white. Because those students have more access to resources and opportunities while they're in the K-12 system, those white students enter college in a more academically advanced position than their peers from minority backgrounds, and this impacts their success, whether those students from underrepresented groups change majors or career paths or drop out of college altogether. As students move into graduate school, the retention rate of those underrepresented groups continues to decrease, with significantly more white students in chemistry graduate programs. It's interesting to note also that the general STEM workforce has a better representation from Black and Hispanic or Latinx communities than employed chemists. And this points to challenges maybe that are specific to chemistry. And so I'd really like to look into this more to learn, why that's true. Next, we are going to talk about women in STEM and chemistry. And so I think it's interesting when you look at the undergraduate enrollment that there are actually more females than males enrolled. But as the level degree progresses, we can see that women are less likely to complete advanced degrees. From this data, it also appears that the representation of women is actually better in the chemistry workforce in comparison to the general STEM workforce. However, an American Chemical Society survey of about 5,500 of their members in 2021 showed that men made significantly more than women. Men on average made about $117,000 a year, while women made only $87,000. Statistics and estimates of proportions of the population with disabilities vary widely, depending on the definition of the term disability and how those disabilities are reported. There may be some variances in how each of these surveys defined the term disability. In general, the US Census includes the following types of disabilities: sensory, physical, mental, self-care, go outside home, and employment disabilities. It would be really interesting to see how these types of disabilities represented in each group here change. I also thought it was surprising to see the number of students that reported disabilities in the undergraduate enrollment of fall 2020. But I do wonder if that is kind of a reflection of COVID and students reaching out for resources that maybe they didn't need, before the pandemic. However, we can see, just as with other underrepresented groups in chemistry, students with disabilities are less and less likely to complete advanced degrees. But like with women in chemistry, in the chemistry workforce, it appears that people with disabilities are better represented in chemistry than in the general STEM workforce. It's also interesting to think about how the population of these underrepresented groups has been changing in STEM over time. So in the past 20 years, there's been the greatest growth for women in STEM professions. There have been small gains in the past 10 years for racial diversity, but not nearly as much change has happened for the disabled population. Another important group I want to mention here is the LGBTQIA+ community. And it's really challenging to find statistics and information like these others that I've reported in chemistry and STEM. But the topics of our conversation today are also applicable to that community as well. It's important that we as science educators not only know and understand the challenges that we face in terms of underrepresented groups and supporting them, but that we also take action to increase DEIR practices in our classrooms. The American Chemical Society has placed DEIR into its mission and core values to state, we embrace and promote diversity in all forms, not only to create a more inclusive environment for the practice of chemistry, but also to provide fair and just outcomes for all to achieve their full potential. Inclusion of and respect for people of all backgrounds, perspectives, experiences, and ideas will lead to superior solutions to world challenges and advance chemistry as a global multidisciplinary science. So in the following slides, we're going to present some ideas for you to try in your classroom or lab that will help support students from all backgrounds and increase the retention of students from underrepresented groups. While we share ideas, you will see that we're highlighting how these practices can be incorporated into ADInstruments' cloud-based platform called LT, and the chemistry content collection that was created in partnership with Vernier Science Education. But we'll also be sharing resources that you could utilize without LT. Research has shown that students who experience a strong sense of belonging in college are more likely to have better mental health, higher academic performance, and increased retention rates. When it comes to increasing students' sense of belonging in your classes or labs, encouraging your students to collaborate and work with their peers is great. I know that many times when I was teaching, students would whine and complain about group work, but I think a lot of their experiences are because of, or a lot of their, I guess, feelings are because of negative experiences that they've had due to poor planning and expectations. So to help coordinate successful and enjoyable group work, we have the following suggestions. So you should acknowledge and celebrate those soft skills, right? Those are the skills that they'll be using all the time in life after college. You should intentionally design student groups. There are many ways to create groups, but one of the biggest challenges students report with group work is how challenging it is to coordinate meeting times. And so perhaps you could survey your students before creating groups to learn about their availability, and then intentionally create groups with different strengths and overlapping availability. You should also be crystal clear with assessment. Students are really stressed about earning high grades, but if they understand how they will be assessed, it helps lower that pressure. And you should also incorporate some peer and self-assessment into those group activities so they have an opportunity to reflect. And then you should also redefine fair. In real life, fair doesn't mean that we all do the same amount of work. Maybe I think we've all been in a group where maybe you've done all the work, or maybe you were the person who struggled to have your voice heard. And so we need to encourage students to assume that their peers have good intentions and focus on the benefits of the work. Students also will have the opportunity, if you are clear with assessment and include self-reflection, if they have that opportunity to share their thoughts on how the group collaborated or worked together, you give them a voice, and then that helps them understand the group dynamics better. And when you're creating projects, they should be big enough that they can't be completed alone. So you could be creative in the way that you have students work together. For lab, you could have students collect their own data and then have them come together to share the data and discuss similarities and differences. In this way, all students would have to participate, and one person just can't do all the work on their own. To learn more about some of these suggestions, we are sharing a document with you called Overcoming Group Work Challenges, a practical approach which was written by Ellen Cribbins, who is one of the senior instructional designers at ADInstruments. LT serves as an electronic lab notebook of sorts that has pre-lab work, the experiments for students to do in lab with live data acquisition, and where they'll also complete post-lab work. But one of the really neat features of LT is that students can log in individually to complete maybe their pre-lab or post-lab assignments, but they can collaboratively collect data in lab together. So the first person that logs into LT is called the group leader, and the data that they collect is then distributed to the individual students. So after lab, they all have access to the data and any group analysis maybe that they collaborated on in lab or class. This makes group work seamless and easy. It minimizes the time taken to distribute data and allows students to really focus on that collaboration piece. Another way to increase your students' sense of belonging is to intentionally highlight chemists from various backgrounds that maybe your students can identify and relate to. When students read chemistry textbooks and learn about the foundational experiments that are the basis for our understanding of chemistry, they see a lot of white men and not scientists or chemists from underrepresented groups. By highlighting chemists in history and in modern times that are representative of diverse groups, students can see that people like them can be chemists. Dr. Sabrina Collins is a chemist who is now the current executive director of STEM education at the Marburger STEM Center at Lawrence Tech University. And she works to promote inclusiveness, excellence, creativity, and innovation. I was actually a student of Dr. Collins, and she always made sure to highlight chemists from diverse backgrounds. In an article in Chemical and Engineering News highlighting Black chemists, Dr. Collins said, "My goal is to really broaden the image of a chemist in the classroom for all my students to see." And she thought by sharing the stories of distinguished Black scientists that it helps level the playing field and help right a far too entrenched wrong of disregarding Black achievement in chemistry or even omitting it from the field's history. To help connect students with scientists from diverse backgrounds and help them build their own scientific identity, Dr. Sarah Martin at the College of Worcester has created a project called Phone a STEM Professional that she and others in the department use with first and second year chemistry students. Dr. Martin has created a database of scientists, mostly alumni from the College of Worcester, and included relevant information about their backgrounds with permission of those professionals. Students then select a person to do an interview with, and then they present their findings to the class. In this way, a student who is struggling, maybe as a Black student in chemistry, can reach out to a professional chemist who has maybe had similar struggles. The student then has the opportunity to learn from a mentor and make a human connection. So often students feel alone, especially those from underrepresented groups. And by connecting students with mentors in a structured assignment, students are able to build connections and a sense of belonging in science. This brings the representation of diverse chemists to real life and allows students to interact and connect with people. In addition to helping students build a sense of belonging, it can be incredibly helpful to help them learn about metacognition, which is the awareness and control of learning. When I speak to educators, one of the things that they state is students' largest weakness is their knowledge of study skills or how to learn. And so the two areas of metacognition are metacognitive knowledge and metacognitive regulation. Metacognitive knowledge involves knowing yourself as a learner, having a growth-focused mindset, and understanding learning strategies. And I think this quote really speaks to the power of metacognition. Before learning about the brain, the student wasn't able to have a growth-focused mindset. And by learning about metacognition, students may see themselves in a new light. I should share this quote. So before doing the reading or having any information about the brain, my mindset was clear on the fact that there are two options out there: naturally smart or not. Metacognitive regulation is deciding which strategies to use, assessing and adjusting learning plans, and assessing the effectiveness of those plans after assessment. So to encourage students to use metacognition, you can instruct students on the power of practice tests so that they really know what they understand and what they don't. You should encourage students to space out their practice so that they're not just cramming the night before an exam, but they're really using their brain to then remember things over time and build the connections that are necessary. They should, as an educator, you should develop practice questions that will help students monitor their learning. Sometimes we have students practice with questions that maybe aren't relevant to the learning objectives. And so that doesn't really help a student know if they understand the relevant content or not. And you should also prompt students to develop study plans and evaluate their approaches after an exam. So if they didn't do well on an exam, let's reflect about what the student did and what they could do better next time. In our chemistry supplementary course resource called Understand Your Chemistry, I really appreciate how metacognition is woven into the lessons. Students have the opportunity to learn about metacognition and put it into action with spaced reviews that are intended for specific times after learning the content. To learn more about the suggestions we've talked about here with metacognition, we're sharing a document called Talking Teaching, How to Encourage Metacognition, which was written by Bryce Peebles, another one of our instructional designers. Okay, next I'd like to talk about the importance of feedback. Students that come to college without adequate preparation truly rely on the feedback that is timely and actionable. This is especially true for feedback on formative assessments. Summative assessment happens at the end of a unit of course and is usually the culmination of long-term learning, but formative assessment allows students to practice their knowledge, adjust, modify, and grow from constructive feedback, which ties back to that metacognitive piece. If students don't receive feedback until days later, they might not be able to take action on that feedback and use it to monitor and adjust their own learning. In addition to being timely, you want to make sure that your feedback is constructive and will help them close gaps in their understanding. Vague or unspecific feedback is not particularly useful. So a simple "good job" or "that's not quite right" will not really help students grow. One of the strengths in LT for both pre-labs and questions that assess students' understanding while they're in the lab is that they get instant feedback. So while students are working on a pre-lab, they can determine whether or not they are connecting the concept from lecture, and they can review those essential topics. Then, as an instructor, you can see the questions that your students struggled with most, and you can provide additional feedback when you get into lab. So here's an example of a question that students would see in a pre-lab and the feedback that they would get. So they get feedback right away, whether they got it incorrect or correct, and maybe some thoughts to help lead them in the right direction. In addition to feedback, providing additional supports and structure into data collection and analysis can help provide equity to all students. Students may come to your lab without having ever been in a lab course before, and those that come from under-resourced schools would be even more negatively impacted. By providing structures that allow students to focus on the science instead of the logistics, you're setting them up so they can be successful. So now I'm going to hand it over to Elaine, who is going to highlight what data collection and analysis look like in LT with our rate law determination lab that looks at the decay of crystal violet under basic conditions.
Thank you, Caitlin. So let me show you what Caitlin just referred to here. Just give me a second to get to that screen. So it's asking me to reload. So what I'm going to demonstrate here is the data collection portion of the rate law determination lab using the Vernier GoDirect SpectroVis plus spectrophotometer. So the rate law determination lab is essentially looking at the reaction between crystal violet and sodium hydroxide and having students determine whether it's zero, first, or second order. Just to demonstrate the activity, let me get to the activity page with the GoDirect SpectroVis Plus. I'll talk about the spectrometer here in just a second while we record data because it will require a couple minutes. So like any device, the first thing you want to do is calibrate. Essentially, it's taking the blank, the background. So I have my spectrophotometer connected to my computer, and then when to hit calibrate, like Caitlin referenced, in terms of student instruction, it really just walks them through it. It's step-by-step process where they can focus on the science, and it's not too much time to have to worry about how to use a device, what does it do, and all that. It's really about, again, learning looking at rate laws is what this lab is the goal. So I'll continue with the blank. And again, like she referenced, it walks you through the setup. I want to put in my blank. In this case, it's just water. And there it is, pretty quick. It scanned the whole full spectrum. Again, the next step is to remove it. It again gives you that student instructions. Then it wants you to insert the sample. In this case, it's the crystal violet. And the reason for this is you want to see the full spectrum so that the students can determine the lambda max to collect the time-based data. So here we have its full spectrum, and it automatically just will pick the lambda max, which is about 587. It's a purple complex, which is about right. But if you want to move it or to change it, you can just take the marker and pick any wavelength along the spectrum, but we'll keep it at about where it was earlier. And then now that I've calibrated, I'm pretty much ready to go. So if you look at the collect data portion, again, these are the same instructions for the lab. What you're going to do is mix about 10 mils of the crystal violet, 10 mils of sodium hydroxide in a beaker, quickly stir, and then rinse a couple times with your cuvette and place it in your spectrometer, and then click on the start button to record. So it'll give me just here a few seconds to mix my reaction. And then once I have that done and I hit start, the data will be collected on the screen, the graph there. And then while the data is collecting, I'll talk a little bit about the spectrometer and its specs and its capabilities. Okay. So I have a reaction mixture. I'm putting it in my spectrometer. Clicking on the start button, and I will let you look at the data collection here, record here for a few seconds before I switch to a different screen. So it's collecting time-based data. It's set to collect for about 180 seconds. It will stop in the 180-second mark, but if you need to stop it earlier, there's always that stop button that you can press, but you ideally want to let this reaction go to completion. And then when that's done, I will look at the analysis. So while it's collecting, let me show you a different tab. I think I should, let's see if I can do this right. Stop sharing on this tab and then share a different one here. There it is. And this is also in the handout section that you can download as well. So this is a visible spectrometer. Its range is from 380 nanometers to 950. It reports at about every nanometer, that is the reporting interval. And there's some additional specs that you can see on there. It's a very small device. The dimensions are listed as well. It's powered by USB. There's no external power supply that you need to worry about. It uses a white light source to gather the spectrum. And there are approximately 4 labs in LT that use this device. Like I said, today we're doing the rate law determination. But the other ones that are very common in the chemistry curriculum will be Beer's law. You can look at the equilibrium constant. That's looking at the using iron thiocyanate. And then another common lab done is the synthesis analysis of aspirin, and where you're looking at using iron to complex the excess salicylic acid to look at how much aspirin you've made. So that's one way to use this device. And again, they're all in LT. And if you have questions, I said during the Q&A, I'm happy to answer questions about the device or the data collection portion of LT. So let's go back to LT and see where we're at in terms of the data collection. Let me go back to sharing the experiment. So yep, so if you look at it, it's pretty much done, because again, you looked at it was a stop button. Now it's start, meaning it's collected the 180 seconds worth of data roughly. So if I click on this arrow to go to the next tab, this is where the analysis comes in. And I know Caitlin made some references about looking at the different 0, first, and second order. So in order for the students to be able to do that, they're going to take different data points along this graph and then enter it here down here in this table. And what it does is it graphs the data here, absorbance versus time. They can look at that graph. Then they can look at the natural log absorbance versus time. and then they can look at 1 overabsorbance versus time. Again, this is talking about the 0, first, and second order, and that is explained here on the right column. And then if you scroll a little bit down on that same page, it goes into some of that, what Caitlin talked about in terms of having students do the analysis, and then the check answer gives that immediate feedback of what the correct answer is. And so it's a nice way for students to get hands-on lab experience, and then what they've appreciated is that immediate feedback on learning. It's not something they have to wait. If you're doing a paper lab and 3 weeks later they get the feedback on an experiment they did a while ago. So there's a great way for different learning styles that students can use, and this way they can do it collaboratively, or they can do it on their own after the fact. And one other feature I want to make a note of is I just showed how to collect data live into LT, but there is also example data. I know some instructors will use example data. I know when teaching went remote and things shut down and students couldn't be in the lab, a lot of instructors provided example data for students to still be able to do learn these concepts without having to be in the lab. So that is preloaded into all the chemistry lab experiments. So you can choose to give them example data, maybe as a makeup, or if they need to learn remotely and can't be in the lab. So that is available as well. So with that, I guess I will pass it back on to Caitlin to continue sharing additional information about DEIR and how LT can fit back into your classroom.
Okay. So the final topic we'd like to touch on is reducing bias. And so many students from underrepresented groups are negatively impacted by biases, especially when we as instructors are grading. The bias that I'm referring to here is implicit bias, which describes our unconscious or unintentional attitudes towards people. Bias isn't inherently negative either. I came across this interesting concept called the halo effect, which is when our positive impressions of people influence how we feel, which would then influences our judgments. For example, a student could be really engaged in lab and ask great questions, but maybe their post-lab work that was submitted is subpar. We may grade them less harshly and not offer the quality feedback that they deserve. And then that student may benefit in the short term with a better grade, but we may not set them up for success in the future. And so, right, our positive impression of them influences then our judgments and our feedback and how we're assessing students. One way you can work to reduce bias in your grading is to grade students anonymously. And so if you're grading a paper assignment, you could have students submit their reports with student ID numbers instead of names, or you could intentionally cover students' names while grading. In LT, there's a great feature where you can actually just select anonymous grading, and your students' names are quickly removed from their work. So here in this panel, you can see on the left, we have the students in the course, and these are their responses to the questions in the lab. So you could click on this and see what their responses were and grade their work. But in this box here, you can select anonymous grading, and then what happens is that all of the student names are removed and you just have student 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? So then the students, or your knowledge of the student as a person in lab, or just as a person in general, is removed, and you're just grading their understanding of the work. Another way we can reduce bias in our grading is to provide students with pre-formatted reports. Students that have not had the same exposure to lab courses as their peers could benefit from being given pre-formatted reports. So all student reports look the same visually and are organized in the same way. This way, your bias towards organized and well-formatted reports don't negatively impact your assessment of the student's understanding. And while it is important to learn how to organize and format a lab report, that's something that you can scaffold with using a pre-formatted lab report. So maybe early in the year, you use these pre-formatted reports, and then as students are developing their skills and building scientific understanding, they can format their own reports on their own. And so I've created a pre-formatted report that I've shared with you today in the webinar resources that you can adapt to your teaching practices and the post-lab work that you expect from students. But I found this really helpful in my own teaching practices. In LT, one of the really nice things is that all reports are formatted the same so that students can focus on understanding the science. And so the report that is printed out after a student completes their lab assignment is formatted the same for each and every student. Everything from answering and responding to questions and the data analysis or annotations maybe that the students did. So in summary, we can all agree that promoting DEIR in our chemistry classrooms or STEM classrooms should be a priority. In our classrooms, we can work to increase students' sense of belonging, teach them metacognition and study skills. We can also provide additional supports, such as timely and constructive feedback and structured learning experiences like those in LT. We can also work to reduce bias in our grading. So if we work to incorporate these ideas into our teaching practices, all students will benefit, but especially those that come from underrepresented groups in chemistry or STEM. If you'd like to learn more about LT and the LT chemistry collection that we've created in partnership with Vernier, please stay until after the Q&A to learn more about getting a full demo or starting a trial. And now we would like to open up the floor for questions.
All right. Thank you both so much for your presentations. Okay, let's get started. So our first question is, as someone who identifies as a woman in science, how do you bring up gender equality without sounding insensitive?
I think for me, it always starts as a genuine conversation. So I think it's important to recognize maybe the privilege that you've had. And I think honestly, being open with students is really important. So there have been times, as a woman that I've struggled in my journey, right, through academia. And I think just being open and honest, students are generally really respectful. And I think that, we all have strengths and weaknesses from our experiences, and just openly sharing those. I think students aren't used to that. And so when they hear those things, they're generally interested in having conversations and learning more.
Great response. Thanks, Caitlin.
Yeah.
Elaine, do you have any personal experiences in this situation?
I guess what I wanted to share more in terms of what Caitlin talked about and being just more genuine in a conversation. I was just at the spring ACS national meeting in Indianapolis this past week, and typically the spring meetings have a lot of students, both undergraduates and graduate students. And being in the expo hall, I get the opportunity to talk to a lot of folks, a lot of educators, and especially a lot of students. They stop by our booth for multiple reasons, and a lot of them are job hunting. And so, they come and just want to talk to you, and you just, have that open, honest conversation. I think it just kind of happens organically. If you feel it forced, it feels uncomfortable. But I think in this current in our current atmosphere, it just kind of comes up. I think it's a very open topic that students are wanting to discuss.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I really like what you said, both of you, about being genuine. I think it's helpful for people when you also can relate to them, of course, being women yourselves. But yeah, having that discussion open, particularly for the people who also aren't women, so that they have that knowledge too, is really important. Okay, our next question for today: how would you approach starting the discussion about DEIR in the classroom for someone who is nervous about doing so or potentially saying the wrong thing?
I think for me, what's really important to feel confident enough to start these conversations is to really educate myself. And so there's a lot in the literature, in chemistry literature, or in general education literature that talks about what people are trying and what they're doing and how to start these conversations and what has been successful and what hasn't. And so for me, I'm a person who always really likes to prepare for conversations ahead of time. And so that helps me feel more confident. But then I think it's okay to also like preface conversations with students by saying, like, if I'm explaining something wrong, or if I'm not using proper terminology, or whatever the thing may be, right? Like if you have that relationship with students and you tell them that you want their feedback and that you're still learning, that helps me from being like nervous about doing the wrong thing. Because students, like they have things to provide too. They know a lot maybe that I don't know. And so like being open and honest maybe about your discomfort is okay. Like that's not necessarily a bad thing. You can be uncomfortable, but also think that something is important. And I think that ties back into that, like the relationship being the center of what you're doing, right? So if you have, an environment in your classroom where students feel comfortable speaking to you and you feel comfortable sharing, that makes me feel less nervous. If I'm afraid about someone like, really having an emotional response and like being more argumentative about something, then yeah, I'm going to be more nervous. But if you kind of create that welcoming and open community where sharing ideas is encouraged, I think that helps me feel less nervous about doing things and admitting that you're going to say the wrong thing sometimes. And that's okay.
Yeah, I was just actually thinking the same thing, that I think being comfortable to talk about it is important because, well, in some classes you could have, so many students in your class that, it would be difficult maybe to have that like kind of one-on-one discussion. But kind of related to the anonymous like lab reports and stuff that you were presenting before, maybe doing it the other way too, and gathering that information anonymously as well would make people feel more comfortable. If anyone has experienced that difficulty in being able to chat one-on-one with their students like that. Perfect. Elaine, did you want to add anything before?
Yeah, I'm not in the classroom at the moment, but actually at our company, we have a kind of a DEI committee that I volunteer on, and we do a lot of monthly, I guess, presentations, whether we bring in a speaker or look at articles or just topics. And one of the things we recently, which I think would fall under the diversity aspect a little bit, is we recently talked about neurodivergent in terms of like a communication and learning styles. And what you referenced, Sydney, is just perfect about the anonymous, because some students might not feel comfortable in this conversation. So having a way for them to communicate to you or have that discussion, whether it's written down anonymously or on paper or some other way, is something else to consider. I mean, I don't present myself as an expert in any of this, and I think that's what's great about the conversations is we just are all having a conversation and learning together, and so that may reduce the barrier. Like I said, just being genuine and honest, and that we all want to learn together. Maybe that's my approach.
I love that. Yeah. That's perfect. Yeah, if for somebody who's not in the classroom as well, we have, like at my company, for example, like a Slack channel, so people can put stuff in there if they come across like articles or just helpful things, information. So I love just the open, continuous learning for everyone as well. Okay, thanks both. Let's move on to this question. Have you experienced resource inequality? So some students perhaps not being able to afford some technology. How do we build courses that don't require those large sums of money to participate actively? And I would say that wouldn't necessarily include, of course, like textbooks. I remember those being very expensive too, but of course necessary. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can maybe move forward with something less costly.
Yeah, I think it's really important to be aware of costs that we're putting on students. And I've heard from a lot of educators that there is, a movement from away from having them buy, the incredibly expensive textbooks, because there are so many great resources out there. And so I guess if I'm reflecting like on my time with students, I did have students that struggled to purchase technology or resources like that we were using for a course. But I think if, as an educator, you strategically choose what you have your students pay for and how you're having them pay for it, um, there are some like clever workarounds that can help lower the cost, right? So instead of buying a $150 lab manual every semester or a $300 textbook, right? Maybe you could have them use a $50 online resource and a free textbook. And so you're having them use technology, right, to actually help them lower the out-of-pocket costs. And a lot of colleges have, programs to help support students that maybe can't get access to a computer or those things. And so that helps lower those barriers if you're not spending, having your students spend over $300 on a course that's maybe for their major and maybe not. And so I think it's about strategically choosing which resources to use, if that makes sense, and how to get students to really get the best bang for their buck, right? So like they're not buying, a lab manual that has 500 experiments that they're not going to use. Like that's actually not a good value for them, right? So to look at the resources and try to really set students up to be spending money in a smart way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. For example, you presented a couple of those online resources through LT, for example. But yeah, it does take, of course, effort on your part as a teacher to kind of figure that out for your students to help them. And yeah, I think that is wonderful options for your students. Okay, let's jump in with one last question now. In a large classroom, so early undergraduate classes sometimes can have, more than 300 students that I mentioned before. How would you encourage these open conversations with that many people? I know that we kind of brought up more of the anonymous,
Yeah.
maybe people not feeling comfortable, but it definitely is still important to bring it up to the entire, class, so that everyone can participate and have that knowledge. What would your recommendation be?
So I think, when you're in a lecture hall with 300 students, right, it's really hard to build that like one-on-one connection, right? So, if you're in a lab with 20 students, you can have that experience. But in a large classroom, it's definitely more of a challenge. And so I think in that situation, you don't have that one-on-one relationship to build off of, right? And so I think then you move almost more into a facilitator of those conversations. And so maybe you're not having the conversations with your students directly, but maybe you're setting expectations for them on how to have conversations with their peers or the people around them or the people they choose to work with that they're comfortable with. I think you set clear expectations for their behavior and the way that they speak to one another. I think you have to be very clear in it, and then guide them kind of through conversations about their experiences. Maybe then you could stop and share a story and have them think about it in smaller groups, because I do think there is, right, like I as a student would never feel comfortable like raising my hand and sharing my experiences with any of this in a room of 400 people. Like that would not have been me as a student. And so I think being a facilitator and setting like a structure for those conversations to happen, it transitions your goal in the way you're leading that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a great recommendation. And of course, something too that can be kind of trial and error. Try it one day. If it doesn't work out, nobody wants to participate, then perhaps it is, audience is shy or not comfortable or whatever the reason is. And in that case, you move on to something else. But even if it's not an open discussion, I think having the discussion with the class is definitely important. Yeah, I don't recall having those conversations back when I was in school, but I think they would have been important for sure. Well, we have reached the top of the hour. I don't know if you have any last comments on any of those questions, if anything came up in your mind, but yeah, otherwise, thank you both so much for being here. Wonderful presentation and some great discussion in this Q&A session.
Great. Thank you for all being here.
Yep. Thank you for doing all this, and thank you for those who are attending.
In closing, we hope you enjoyed this Inside Scientific webinar sponsored by ADInstruments, and we'll see you again next week for the fourth and final webinar in the series.